the agenda for today, Amy is going to give us an overview of the application process and the form. Then Simon Carman will talk about the financial and economic assessment model. This is the FEAM. And then Andrew will cover off some of the technical inputs that we require from you as part of the application process. And we'll just highlight some of the guidance and support that's available for you as you work your way through your HNIP journey. So I will hand over to Amy now.
Thanks, Sam. I'm just trying to get to grips with, why is it not clicking forward? There we go. So yes, as Sam said, my name is Amy and I work on the triple side of things as a BDM. So if you've come forward for an application, you've probably spoken to either myself or Lauren as the dedicated BDMs on the team. This presentation is probably best for those that are looking for a submission in the current round 9. So I think, yes, pre-application is actually, the deadline is today. If you haven't got it in, I think there's only 2 that we're expecting in. The deadline is actually midnight. I wouldn't probably suggest leaving it that late, but you can. And then our round 9 full application deadline is the 2nd of April. We will have a round 10 pre-app deadline on the 2nd of June, and that full app will be the following July. I'd be very hesitant on the round 11. So if you are looking to submit something later on, if you're on this call and just trying to get to grips with the application, I would advise you just to get in as soon as possible. After each round, we have an investment committee that convene and the decision is made at that meeting for which projects will be funded following their submission on the full application. We've got a host of resources and news items on our website. So if you are interested in looking at some of the funded projects, there's a nice picture of you in there, I think, from ACOM at one of the projects. So do please go onto the website and you can have a look at those. And if you've got any questions, we're more than happy to kind of discuss those in more detail because they are they're public and the projects have provided their consent to go out about their project. I think Sam has set up a short questionnaire / survey for those who are looking to get the slide pack of this presentation. So I think that's mainly for us to get some feedback. So if you do have any feedback on this particular webinar and any other events, that would be really helpful as we're always looking to improve what we can do. On to the, next slide is about the application guidance. We did recently update this. So we have done an updated application guidance, but there's also a host of documents on our website which include clarification documents. So looking at counterfactual technology using an SPV, how we take into account customer detriment. There's also our SOMS pack on there. There's a document checklist, which I would advise, especially for those looking at the round 9 application, please do have a look at that. Because as well as the spreadsheet application form, we do require a host of documentation aside that. So that's really helpful to look at and use it as a checklist. We've also got details on our monitoring and reporting. So any successful project will be subject to monitoring and reporting once they've accepted their awards, signed their funding agreement. So a header look would be really helpful if you're interested in that. So the application process itself. So the application guidance is our Bible document and kind of goes into detail about general scheme eligibility, all the scoring criteria and the supporting documentation. Most of you might have seen the actual Excel workbook that we use for the application form now. So it's gone through various stages of updates. I think we're on version 5 something now. The pre-application is a pre-eligibility check with a high-level overview from the applicant. It's not set in stone. These can change, and we can withdraw projects if you don't want to go any further. The full application is then more detailed questions and what Simon will be talking about on the FEAM tab input. So there will be several extra tabs on this. We use a application portal called the DAS. So if we ever mention this to you, this is just a platform for which you will submit your application form. It will create a separate space for your application, and then that's where you will then go on to upload all your supplementary documents and anything else that needs to go through it. If you've got any questions on that, by all means, just throw it over to us. So feedback throughout the process, generally as we go along, we will try to flag any issues, whether that's at the pre-app and also at the full app stage. So if anything doesn't look quite right to us, we will try and flag that immediately. If the pre-app doesn't seem to be eligible, we will provide an overview on that and what we think is needed for it to proceed to full application. Generally, I don't think we've really had to do that, apart from the ones where you'd be surprised that I think we had a couple of applications and they just weren't a heat network. So it's sort of generally it's okay. It's more when we get to the full application, we will go through after the submission, there will be a clarifications process. So we will go back asking for more in-depth information just to make sure that we've got a full and complete understanding of the project. It's quite a strict, I guess the application form itself being on Excel, it's quite tight, but we obviously want to make sure that we've got the best understanding of the project, and that's why we ask for this supplementary information. If it doesn't go through to assessment or is unsuccessful, the BDMs and myself or Lauren will pick this up with you and have a conversation. We'll usually bring in ACOM, Simon from Astros and other members of the team, such as Amber, to sort of discuss this, and this conversation will flow through from the pre-app all the way through. So if you've got any questions or you think it's better, I put my hands up because I'm not a technical engineer. I don't know the ins and outs of the technical side of things. So we pull on ACOM for that, and any kind of questions or anything you want to discuss in detail, we try and encourage the conversation so that we know exactly how your application should be looking, so that we can do the assessment properly. If it is unsuccessful, well, successful or not successful, you will receive a notification letter once it's been submitted. So that will be after the investment committee. Usually, if we don't decide to fund the project, it's not to say that we don't think you should come back again. We will obviously highlight the areas that sort of were the downfalls within the assessment and encourage the applicant to sort of revisit and perhaps see if they can improve the application to submit into the next round. So by all means, it's not a hard line to say you've not been awarded funding, please don't come back. By all means, we would definitely encourage you to try and resubmit if you can. So onto the application form itself. Many of you might have seen the pre-application. This is just sort of some general questions about projects and kind of contact details and all of that. So the full application form tab, I guess, is an extension to this. So with the usual contact details and an overview of the project, we'll also ask about sort of the financial structure and how the project will be delivered. We'll also want to understand sort of the procurement process that you'd like to be going through, sort of stakeholder questions, so any planning that might have been submitted or has been approved, the idea of self-certifying if it's strategic, this comes into play if it's a negative SMTV, but that will come out into the assessment. So you'll notice that it's I think that project description is up to 300 words max, so it's quite brief, so it shouldn't actually take, I think we normally say it shouldn't really take any more than an hour to fill out the pre-app and the full app question form. But that bit should be relatively straightforward. You can download I would suggest downloading the latest application form from the website. As I said, we do go through iterations. Sometimes this is adding extra questions, kind of changing the format. So if you're not sure, go to the website and download the latest versions so that you've got that to hand. Please read all the documents carefully before submitting the application. As I said, we've got the document checklist. I can't remember what page that is in, but that's in the application guidance, just to make sure you are aware of what we require. The actual application form itself, you will need to enable editing and enable content in order to complete the form. We will also have a disclaimer page, so once those are all selected, you'll then be able to open up, I think it opens up automatically all of the tabs, so if not, just unhide them and you should be able to see sort of 7 to 8 tabs, I think it is. You'll also notice that there will be guidance text. So we may say that you can obviously submit a document referencing a lot more information because we obviously can't fit all the text in the application form. So if you are referencing any other documents that are going to be submitted onto your DAS portal, what's really helpful is if there is a way of you sort of coding or just providing a reference number or letter so that when we are looking at that particular question, we know where to go to in terms of the document that it's relating to. It just makes it a lot easier for the assessment team to understand what document will contain which part of the information. There's also, we've also set it up so that there will be hidden questions. If you're not sure, my best bet or my best advice would be to toggle between the different options so that you can see whether or not there have been questions hidden, and that might sort of, it is dependent on the answer that you give. So if you just want to see kind of, normally it's a yes or no, so have a look at what comes up when you say no, have a look at what comes up when you say yes, and if actually you do feel you need to answer those questions, by all means change it and provide the information. I think the next slide will give you, there you go. So as you can see, when it's switched to yes, we obviously then get these other questions that come up. So if you think you've got something that actually is useful for those, by all means add that in. Make sure you work through the entire workbook. I know it's sort of a very time-consuming thing, but it is really helpful when we don't have any sort of missing gaps. And again, any of those questions that might be hidden, if they're relevant, by all means, please answer them. We usually say sort of anything that you can submit as evidence, by all means, please do. The assessment team will hate me for saying that, but they do have a duty to read through all your documents, and the more information we get, the better picture we can get. So if there are any problems with the data input, we know sort of how it should look. And just make sure that any approvals and any documents that you are submitting are the most up-to-date version. Again, just mention this, so any extra documents, if you can just please give sort of, I guess not a contents page, but just a reference document outlining what each document references to, that would be really useful, especially when it comes to the commercialisation activity plan. If you're able to give as much detail on timescales, costing, dates, it is all really helpful. So the more detailed, the better. As I said with the pre-app, the full app deadline as well, I think is midnight. I wouldn't suggest leaving it that late. And actually, we do advise that if you're able to send through your FEAM sheet, your financial model, especially the guys at Amberside and Astros, we welcome a discussion, so we can do a high-level overview before you guys submit those to the DAS. It just helps us to iron out any of the niggles, perhaps small mistakes that have been made. We know you guys are sort of focusing on these in the end 24/7, so it's easy to kind of have the same set of eyes, but sometimes if we can just have a look, we can kind of pick out a few things that might not be quite right. We do require one of our eligibility criteria is that we do require projects to have a positive IRR without any HNIP intervention. So this just needs to be above 0. If it does dip below 0, we'll have to look at this. And we have had instances before where the data input might be swinging this a little bit, but we just need to make sure that that is positive before we go ahead with kind of assessing any projects. Again, another eligibility criteria. So we are, I think being pedantic, it's actually 49.5%. So we can fund up to 50% of capital expenditure for the projects. We actually advise that applicants look sort of 20 to 30%. We have recently, again, if you're speaking to either myself or Lauren, we have released target ratios. So actually, it's relative to the amount of heat and carbon you are delivering. Again, we welcome any figures that you're able to provide on this so that we can understand how this might play out into an assessment. For anything above this 50%, we just won't be able to fund. A few projects do come in with a high contingency. We do sort of look into this. So I would suggest, if you can, just be wary if you're pushing that number up quite a little bit. We obviously have ACOM who are very astute in this sort of work, so they sort of understand the level of contingency that's required and what's appropriate for various projects. In relation to what I just mentioned about the 50% capex, so the scoring is based on 4 key criteria. 2 of these are the heat delivered and the carbon savings, and that's divided by the gross grant equivalent. There's more information in the application guidance about the gross grant equivalent itself, but essentially what we would like projects to do is deliver a high amount of heat and higher carbon savings for as little funding as possible. That way, I guess, as a scheme overall for HNIP, we're sort of doing the best that we can. The ratio targets and the heat delivered and carbon savings over the GGE, that will be over the first 15 years of operation. So actually, I think they're the targets there for you. So anyone, make a note of those by all means. If you've got any more questions on those, fire them at me and Lauren. More than happy to sort of take a look at the figures, and we do a rough calculation, and it sort of can help flag to us where your main downfall might be. We know it's easier said than done to sort of look at, or can you bring anything forward in terms of connections? Can you reduce the ask of HNIP? But it's sort of, we will flag this if we think something is a little bit off. Again, this is not to say that, what I should mention is that those ratios, if you do reach those, it's not to say that we will definitely guarantee your funding. Again, the nature of HNIP and the rounds that we have, that it is a competition, so it will all be relative to the projects that we receive. But those that do sort of try and hit those will be in a better chance of securing funding. Before I move on to Andrew, are there any questions on the application form itself or the target ratios? If not, I will leave to Andrew.
Amy, we did have one. You mentioned that we're expecting 2 pre-applications to come through today. We do occasionally get more than we're expecting. Do we have indications of the applications that might be coming through in future funding rounds? It'd be good if you could talk a little bit around the pipeline and some of the ways that we sort of track potential projects coming through.
Yeah, sure. So probably what I should have added then was that actually pre-applications are welcome anytime. So you can submit a pre-application at any point of the competition, working backwards. If you sort of require funding by a certain time, then we would say, look at when you need to submit your full application and then when you need to submit your pre-app. Lauren and I and the team, we do have our own sort of pipeline. It's nothing too fancy. It's kind of how we track our projects. So we do have an idea of the projects that we do expect. A lot of so we've obviously got HNDU, which is sort of the predecessor. So we've worked with a lot of local authorities that have come through that pipeline of projects. But then we've also got some private sector projects. I can't give details exactly on those that we're expecting, but we do generally understand who we will be expecting in which round, sort of understanding how that might affect the available budget and the competition of the next round. But again, we know that projects have a certain level of sign-off. They might not be able to get their sign-off in time to actually submit. So it's ever changing, but yes, we do sort of have an idea of who we're expecting. And I guess that's one reason why I mentioned the round 11, is that if we think a project is sort of looking at that very late stage, it's an idea to get it in as soon as possible and see how we can push you forward, because it's as you can imagine, the funding pot is decreasing, but the number of projects seem to be increasing. So it's becoming a fine balance, but we will try and highlight that where we can.
Great, thanks, Amy. And another question either for Amy or Andrew around the ratios that we covered off on the previous slide. are these over the project lifetime, or are they on an annual basis?
I think they're over the 15 years of operation. Is that right, Andrew?
That's right. Yeah, it's the heat delivered over the first 15 years of the scheme, and similarly the carbon saved over the first 15 years, as compared, in the case of the carbon saved, as compared to the counterfactual that applies to the scheme. If we haven't covered counterfactual later, we'll remember to pick it up later on.
Thanks, Andrew. Were there any other questions on that first section? Nope. Okay, so I think we'll hand over to Simon now, please.
Shall I stop
Hi.
sharing my screen and Simon, you can share yours?
That'd be great. Yes, thank you. I can't do this and talk at the same time. Can you see my screen?
Yeah, just come up.
Okay. Okay, should be full screen now. Good morning. I'm Simon Carman. I work for Astros Advisors. We're part of the Triple Point Consortium. Our responsibility on this project is in relation to the three of the key assessment criteria, which are assessed using the financial and economic assessment model, the FEAM. We built the FEAM bespoke, and we operate it during the assessment process. So that's my role. I guess just picking up from Amy's pointing about us wanting to understand your projects as accurately as we can. For me, a key purpose of this session and other sessions that we offer is that we get through the process of receiving the data about your projects, and that data being plugged into the FEAM, and the data being provided in a way that generates sensible results from the FEAM, so that we can use a relatively short window of time to go through our clarification process. And we use that clarification process to ask questions that are genuinely enlightening about your project, rather than asking you to correct errors that could be easily avoided. The guidance that Amy mentioned is its strength is that it's very thorough, and if you have a particular issue with in a particular area, you'll probably find the answers somewhere in it. I guess the weakness of the guidance is that there's a lot of it, and if you want to pull out the really key things from that guidance, the key pitfalls to avoid, it can be quite difficult to see the wood for the trees. So I'm going to try to home in on the issues that we see fairly regularly, that are easily avoided, and that's to help you present your project as painlessly as you can, and for us to receive data that's as useful as possible, as early as possible. So that's really the purpose of what I'm doing. So in relation to the FEAM and the financial information specifically, we ask you to provide your own financial model, and to complete the FEAM sections of the application form. So the FEAM sections of the application form are the yellow tabs. There's 6 of them in the full application form. Your own financial model, I'm not going to talk about for the rest of this session. It's described in section 5.6 and appendix E of the guidance documentation, and it's provided largely for us to understand how for us to reconcile the figures, I guess, that you provide in the FEAM application forms, the outputs that we get from the FEAM to your financial model. We understand that you're likely to present your financial model in nominal terms, i.e. with inflation in it, and you'll be interested in returns post-tax and post-financing. Our FEAM works pre-financing, pre-tax, and in real terms. So when we talk about internal rates of return. Our internal rates of return might be different to the ones that you find useful in your process. So we use the financial model to kind of reconcile between the two of them. So the I think just for me to add a little bit more in relation to those metrics that we just provided, around the amount of carbon saved and the amount of heat generated. This scheme is about funding an IRR gap. So those metrics aren't provided, and indeed the 50% of capex figure aren't provided as a way for you to target what intervention you're trying to ask for. They're very much not provided for that reason. The targeting that you should be doing in terms of your financial modelling is evidencing to us what internal rate of return you need as a project, and why, and then you'll provide us with numbers that indicate a level of return that is lower than that, and the FEAM, fundamentally what it does is it sizes the level of support and the type of support to bridge that gap, and it will generate a level of intervention coming out of that. We will then check to for instance, the 50% of capex and other numbers, and the score will be in reference to the amount of heat generated and the amount of carbon saved, but fundamentally the intervention required is sized as a funding gap on this program. So as Amy's already mentioned, she's mentioned two metrics. There are three metrics that are scored by the FEAM, and there are actually 4 scoring metrics in total that add up to 100%. That gives you your application score. So we have the total amount of heat generated over 15 years has been mentioned, divided by the gross grant equivalent of the intervention. If it's a grant, the gross grant equivalent of a grant is 100%. So if you're asking for £1 million of grant, then the gross grant equivalent is £1 million. If you're asking for a loan, then the gross grant equivalent of £1 million of loan will be something considerably less than that. Second metric, total carbon dioxide saved over 15 years, again compared with a counterfactual, which I'll talk a little bit more about. And the third metric that's calculated by the FEAM as part of the scoring is the volume of CO2 saved through future decarbonisation and expansion. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. The FEAM also carries out some kind of pass-fail tests or indicative tests, as well as the scoring. One is a social net present value test. So we expect applications to have a positive social net present value. That's calculated in accordance with fairly technical Green Book rules, and is a public sector calculation of the value of the project socially, including carbon saved and other emission savings, and the FEAM calculates that. We don't ask you to calculate that. It also it is required that particularly the residential customers, domestic and residential customers, don't pay more than they would have done under the scheme. And there's a state aid test or indicator. It always was an indicator rather than a hard and fast test, but it's even more so now that the state aid rules are up in the air following leaving the EU on the 1st of January. So, and again, I can talk a little bit more about that if people are interested in that. So the SMPV test, we a couple of years back there was a pilot to this scheme, and on the pilot, applicants were asked to calculate the SMPV themselves, and particularly private sector applicants found it quite a difficult thing to do. So we calculate it for you. I'm afraid it's a bit of a black box. We don't provide the FEAM to you to see that. But if you want to submit your application form completed for most of the numbers in the FEAM tabs, we can plug that into the FEAM and have a call with you to discuss the SMPV, or to let you know if there's an issue. This hasn't tended to be an issue for most projects, the SMPV, because most projects are strongly carbon saving, and there's quite a significant benefit given from the carbon savings. We compare the project SMPV, which is essentially the capital costs and the replacement costs over a 60-year period, with plus the cost of the carbon and the cost of the other emissions. All of that's added up and discounted using a public sector discount rate over a 60-year period. We have one number for the project and one number for a deemed counterfactual. The only thing we ask for in relation to the counterfactual from you is, against each customer, there's a drop down box where we ask you to choose what the counterfactual is for that particular customer, and then we have a mass of standing data within the model that then generates the counterfactual social net present value, and we compare one with the other. If your project doesn't have a positive SMPV, it can still be eligible if it's deemed strategic, and the strategic test isn't a kind of intuitive test about whether you think it might be strategic. The strategic test is a series of criterion which are published in the guidance, against which you can look down that list of criteria and assess for yourself whether you believe your project is strategic against any of those criteria. But that's a further way that it could get through the SMPV test if it fails on the actual numbers. Sam, I'm hoping that you'll let me know. I can't see if people are asking questions on the chat, because
yeah, so we've had a couple through actually, Simon. So the first one around how the FEAM assesses carbon saved from future decarbonisation and expansion. Is this based on information provided by the applicant or another methodology? I started typing out an answer and sent it a little bit too quickly, but those metrics are based on information from the applicant, but also some metrics provided by government as well. But someone was wondering whether you could provide a little bit more information on how those are calculated.
Sam, you've answered the direct question. I will be going into that
in a bit more detail.
Yeah, I'll if I get when I get through the slides, I'll flash the application form up, and there are two tabs in there that collect information from applicants for future decarbonisation, and it'll become apparent what we do with that information when I show that.
And then just on the SMPV, as you're on that slide, we refer to it as a bit of a black box. But are we able to give a bit more information about the metrics that will affect the calculation?
So it's cost. It's the cost of providing the heat to the heat. Sorry, it's the cost of satisfying the demand that has been identified by the applicant in the FEAM demand input sheet. So if there are a bunch of customers, and the demand for those customers over time is provided in there, and we cost up a counterfactual and the scheme in relation to how much it costs to deliver the heat to those that amount of heat to those customers. So that's the first thing. If we take the scheme as the first example, you have the profiled capital cost, the initial capital cost, and the replacement capital costs over the 60 years of the scheme. That's provided in real terms by the applicant. We just put those cash flows in the relevant years to which they apply to. We have the fuel cost, and we have the other operating costs, the maintenance and other operating costs. So they're the costs that we put in on that side, if there's electricity generated by, say, a CHP, then we'd subtract the electricity, the value of the electricity that is generated from that cost. So that comes up with the top half of the calculation, which is a financial cost. The bottom half then is costing up the carbon dioxide emissions and some of the other emissions, nitrogen emissions, and they're costed in terms of what the amount is that is generated, which is what the fuel type is and what the emission factors are that are published by government, and then we multiply that by a cost that again is published by HM Treasury, published by government, and that gives an economic cost for those emissions. Add it all up, discount it using the public sector discount rate, and that gives you the SNPV for the scheme. And we effectively do exactly the same for the deemed counterfactual, but the counterfactual is entirely based on standing data within our model, standing data in relation to the cost of the technologies, in relation to the replacement profiles, in relation to the amount of fuel used, in relation to the amount of carbon generated. So that's the black box bit of it, I guess.
Thanks, Simon.
So just to add to that point in a slightly different take on it, projects that fail the SNPV test are normally struggling in other respects, because it's a sign that the project was in a weak place financially to start with and isn't saving enough carbon, if to kind of offset its relatively weak financial performance, because as Simon said, it's the social bit is represented primarily by carbon and air quality improvements. It's not the most sophisticated. It's complicated enough, but it's not got everything in it. So if a project's rubbing up against this problem, it is probably relatively weak, and that's a warning sign that in the later part of the competition, projects that have been funded have generally not had a problem with this.
Okay, do you think I should move on, Sam? Or have you got any
Yeah,
other questions?
just a response from James saying thank you for the answer in regards to the SNPV. Not sure if the calculation is explained in the guidance, which I don't think it is in that sort of format, but they'd like to understand what the main parts are used for the model. So perhaps as we go through, James, if you've still got any questions after the session, we can pick this up with you. But if we move on through the rest of the presentation and talk through the FEAM, it may become a little bit clearer.
Okay. Okay, so this is the counterfactual bit, half of the SNPV calculation. So the counterfactuals, the scheme is assessed on the basis of the information provided by the applicant. As I said, the only information related to counterfactual that we receive from applicants is what the counterfactual is for each of the customers. There's a list of possible counterfactuals for which you need to from which you need to choose, and this is the list that we have standing data for. So again, part of the trick with the application for the application process is to fit your project as accurately as you can within the application form that is necessarily quite is very standardized. So some of the conversations we have around some of the more recent technologies are around how they can best be represented within the application form, and we're happy to have those kind of conversations on a one-to-one basis if you're struggling, or if you can't immediately see how you should best present it. So the counterfactual is generated based on Bayes assumptions and standardized data. I've already said that, and it uses published guidance, HM Treasury guidance. The counterfactual is used for the SNPV test, where we're comparing the scheme to a counterfactual in economic terms. It's used it's used as the basis of the carbon saving calculation. So we look at the carbon that's generated by the scheme, compare it with the carbon that is generated by the deemed counterfactual, and that's the carbon saving. And it's used for the customer detriment calculation as well. So it's used in 3 places within the model. Oops, I don't. Oh, sorry. That's the wrong buttons. Excuse me.
Simon, just whilst you're getting through. Oh, there we go. Question slide, perfect. So we've just had a question through from Sam asking whether the figures that we use to calculate the counterfactual technologies have they been updated or evolved over the HNIP program. They've mentioned specifically that Brexit has caused an increase in equipment costs, and whether those sorts of things are taken into account.
They are they've been updated for the emissions factors which are published by BEIS, but they haven't been updated for things like Brexit. So the costs are as they were back in back when the model was developed, kind of uplifted to track inflation, but that's about it.
Thanks, Simon. Were there any other questions for Simon before we move on? Nope. Okay, Simon, carry on, please.
Okay, I'm not entirely sure how helpful this diagram is. This is me in lieu of providing you with a copy of the model, which we aren't doing. I've tried to present the model in diagrammatic form, so I'll just quickly talk through this. So this diagram shows the two aspects of the information that's within in the FEAM. Down the left hand side, as I'm looking at it, is the project information. Down the right hand side is the counterfactual information, and then the two get compared with each other, as I said, for the to see whether there's positive SMPV, to see whether there's no customer detriment, and to identify the amount of CO2 saved. So the information in relation to the project, all the inputs come from the FEAM sheets of the application form. The way we work the model is we simply we have a replica of the input sheets within the model, and those input sheets drive all the calculations in the model. So we just link those input cells in the model to the same cells in the application form. So your application form comes in, we link your application form to the model, and the model populates with all your data. And hopefully on the dashboard we see sensible answers. Or sensible outputs. So we have a range of cash flow inputs, which go down the left in the blue, which lead into the financial appraisal. The key of the financial appraisal in relation to size of the intervention is the cash flow element at a summary level. So at its very simplest, we have the summary cash flows for the initial capex, the summary cash flows for the replacement capex, for the fuel costs, for the operating costs, less any external, say, grant income that's coming in. That gives us a net cash flow, and then we calculate an internal rate of return from that net cash flow, and we calculate that pre-intervention, and then we size the intervention by targeting a post-intervention internal rate of return. So that's the financial bit of the project. The where we've asked for some of the cost information in a little bit more detail, categorized particularly against distribution and generation. That was in order to support the state aid test, where we were following the GBR 46 element of the state aid regulations, and there's a calculation in the model that gives an indication about whether with the HNIP intervention, whether the HNIP intervention might break state aid rules as were. There are some physical inputs. We need some physical inputs in relation to the generation technologies, particularly, and the demand, in order that we can calculate things like emission factors and fuel demand for the counterfactual and stuff like that. And they feed down into the SMPV calculation, one half for the counterfactual and one half for the scheme. And over on the other side, basically, we have a load of standing data, as I've already mentioned. And you're welcome to work your way through that in your own time, but I don't think there's much more to be said. The only other point is that we have genuinely tried to ask for the minimum data set that we need for your project to calculate the metrics that we need to satisfy the scheme. And although initially it looks like a big ask in terms of the data we're asking for, I think we've done pretty well, to be honest, in terms of minimizing the data we're asking for from you. I think one of the main issues is the fact that we need 60 years worth of data, and the model breaks if we don't have 60 years worth of data, and that's been one of the challenges that some of the applicants have talked about. So we didn't start with a financial model and modify it for this process. We built it entirely from scratch, so it only generates the metrics that are needed for the assessment process. It could have done a lot more than it does, but it doesn't need to. So if the more we'd built into it, the more data it would have needed to feed it, and the more time it would have taken to run. So it genuinely only really does what it needs to do for the assessment process, which I think has had a benefit to the process in terms of the data that we ask for. We built it. We're using the FEAM in order to ensure consistency of treatment between applicants, so that different financial modelling is done in different ways. We have a standard way of doing the financial model. We don't need to financially model assure or ask you to model assure your models that you submit. Our model has been model assured, so we have confidence in it, and it's now been used quite a lot over the last couple of years. We've provided some validation checks within the model that we think are helpful to you and helpful to us to have confidence around the data. Bayes has always been keen that the application process is about representing the project as accurately as possible, rather than the data being provided that maximizes the amount of award that is given. And we have checks, and the standardization helps us to spot where it looks like people are targeting to maximise the intervention, rather than asking for what the project genuinely needs to meet its IRR hurdle. And it was a specific requirement to remove the need for applicants to calculate the social net present value themselves, because it was a painful process for applicants during the pilot stage. Again, Sam, you're welcome to interrupt me if you want me to address any questions.
No further ones have come through yet.
Okay. I think we'll get into the application form in a second, and then I'll try and wrap up to leave Andrew with a decent amount of time. How am I doing for time, Sam?
I think you're okay.
Okay, so
Yeah.
within the FEAM sheets of application form, the yellow tabs, there's actually another tab in here which doesn't go into the FEAM. So there's a tab called, I think, FEAM pipe inputs, which is data that's gathered for our technical colleagues to assess, to gather some more information about the pipe network, but that information doesn't go into the FEAM model itself. the ones that do populate the FEAM are the FEAM Network Inputs tab, the Demand Inputs tab, the Cost Inputs tab, and then there's two tabs in relation to future decarbonisation, which somebody asked about earlier. Input data, please, in the yellow cells. The other color coded cells shouldn't allow you to enter data into them. They should be locked. So we have some color coding conventions that are pretty normal for financial modeling, and we have some checks in there. It isn't a requirement that you submit the application form with all of the checks as okay. We do see application forms with some checks that haven't cleared. That doesn't affect the assessment process at all, other than if it indicates to us there's a data inconsistency issue, then it might generate a clarification. But it is still possible, I think, to present data in a way that gives an inconsistency check error when there isn't actually an inconsistency error, and it might be to do with decimal points or other stuff. So if you're worried about it, they're mainly there to help the applicants. If you get a check error, have a look to see what's going on. If you're happy with the data that you've presented, then, and it's still giving you an error check, you can either check with us and we can give you comfort that it's okay, or you just submit it and it'll come out in the clarification process. The structure of the model is really key, as I've said, or the structure of the application form is really key. If you've managed to break the password and insert a row, it would mess everything up because of the data mapping from the FEAM to the application form. Nobody has yet done it, which is great. I think when I did these slides originally, I thought that might happen, but it hasn't. That's really good. We do see a lot though of application forms where the unit conventions aren't followed. So if you provide information in pounds instead of pound thousands, so we ask for pound thousands, then your SMPV calculation will look very odd indeed. You'll look 1,000 times more expensive than the counterfactual, for instance. If you provide megawatt hours instead of kilowatt hours, similarly, if you provide pounds per kilowatt hour instead of pence per kilowatt hour, again it messes things up. So all the units are provided against the data entry lines. Just keep an eye on that, please, because that will be, we will spot that if that happens, but that will be your first round of clarifications, and I'd rather your first round of clarifications were genuinely enlightening your project rather than correcting things that could have come in okay in the first instance. We have comments. If you hover over some of the cells and you're scratching your head a bit, there are some comments there that are meant to be helpful. There are some drop-down lists that only allow you to select certain types of information, and the timescales. Please, we need 60 years worth of data in the application form, and we're very supportive of you having a one-to-one session with us if you're having trouble figuring out how best to present your data within the application forms. I think the way it works best is usually if you have a go first, and then maybe send us your completed application form in advance of that session, and if you can give us advance notice of a couple of questions you have, then we can usually have a pretty efficient session with you about that, and they've worked very well in the past. These are the timescales. Someone was asking about what the project carbon saving metric and the project heat delivered metrics. The project carbon saving and heat delivered are scored over 15 years. Future decarbonisation expansion is over 30 years, but only for measures that are implemented during the first 15 years. The intervention appraisal, so the IRR test, is done over 40 years. the SMPV test is done over 60 years and the state aid test is done over 25 years, just for good measure. So I'm going to rattle past that. And sorry, can I just spend maybe 10 minutes or so just having a quick look at the application form? Is that okay, Sam?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. As I said, there are 6 tabs in here, the yellow tabs, which collect the data. There's a lot of the FEAM network input tabs at the top of it. We're asking about the generation technologies and asking for a limited amount of information about the generation technologies. There are quite a lot of them, 20 or so of them, but I don't think we've seen projects with more than about 3. So that's a bit over the top, but you certainly don't need to put information in all of those. There's only 12. We ask then for some, so you can see here in this column H where we're showing you what the units are that we're asking for. There's some information about the network, there's some information about the network losses, and there's some summary information about your total heat demand and cooling demand and private wire demand. These are grayed out because at the top there's a yes no asking whether you're providing cooling or private wire electricity. Some information about tariffs. This information doesn't affect the FEAM, doesn't go into the FEAM as such. It's just used for information for us. Some tariff information, and then this is kind of the guts of the calculation, the IRR calculation. So we're asking here for total revenues split between fixed and variable and connection charges. So that's total revenues by year. Other electrical revenues, other revenues. If you have other support for the project, and where we've seen this a little bit was on RHI, which is now winding out. But if you have RHI income for elements of the project that you're asking for as part of this application, then government doesn't want to support it twice. And the way we prefer to see it is, rather than excluding the capital cost and the ongoing costs of that equipment that is being supported, it's more helpful for us to see the capital costs and the ongoing costs of that item plus the associated revenue. So in IRR terms, they net out against each other. So then we have the initial capex split between energy centre and heat distribution. We have the repex, which gives you a total capex figure, operating costs, fuel, maintenance, and other costs, and then it generates this cash flow line here, which is just a net cash flow of incoming cash less outgoing cash. And this number here is probably helpful. This is the pre-intervention IRR as would be calculated within the FEAM itself. So when we're talking about gap funding, we add an intervention that is the difference that gets you from a pre-intervention IRR up to your hurdle rates. And if you want to test in here what, say, a grant might be, you could add, I don't know what it would be in this. You could add a grant number, and then it would give you a. Oh, it won't do there because sorry, I shouldn't do this live because it needs a negative number. An IRR. Then give you a post-intervention IRR, which is clearly too high. So so that's the pre-intervention IRR figure, which you can use as a check for yourselves. The one absolute in relation to that is that we need a positive pre-intervention IRR, not a negative pre-intervention IRR. So that's the scheme eligibility criterion. So that's the heart of the information for the cash flows for the intervention sizing calculation. And then there's some capacity and demand numbers down here. These ticks here relate to information that you're providing elsewhere in the application forms. So for instance, on the capital cost, initial capex in the cost input sheet, where you're providing your capital cost input broken down into more detail, if you've got a different number in here to what the total is on the front, it'll give you a reconciliation error. So you've said in total a capex for the initial energy centre is 1,000. In the cost inputs, it's saying 1,500. So you're getting a reconciliation error. So that's what those ticks are for, to enable you just to double check that the inputs are consistent across the application form. I'm not going to talk much about that. That's Andrew's going to talk a little bit more about that. Demand inputs, you have your customers, and then you please provide as much of this information as you can. We absolutely do need the gas counterfactual to be chosen here, or the SMPV test doesn't work. That's where you put your counterfactual choice. This pre-populates. If you say your annual demand is 100,000, it pre-populates across here, but you're welcome to just overtype this if you want to show a ramp up. That was being helpful, we thought. Heating, cooling by customer and private wire by customer. There's not much more on that sheet. This is
Simon, to just interrupt you. You said gas counterfactual, whereas I'm sure you meant to say the counterfactual for whatever is relevant to that customer.
Sorry, did I say gas counterfactual? That's because I've read.
You did say gas counterfactual.
Sorry, yes, whatever counterfactual is relevant to that customer. So you have your drop down list here. Yeah. Sorry, that's because I read gas. My brain works that way. This is the information that doesn't go into the FEAM, but if you could provide this for our technical colleagues, that would be helpful. And finally, for me, the future decarbonisation. So there is an element of the 100% is available for future decarbonisation proposals. There's two types that we envisage. So particularly when at the start of this scheme, and time has moved quite quickly actually, we envisage seeing mostly CHP led schemes, gas CHP led schemes, and we envisage then that the proposals would be, there would be proposals to replace the gas CHP with a more carbon efficient generation source sometime in the near future. So if there'd been gas CHP, then in here we've got the ability for you to say we'd replace gas CHP with a ground source heat pump or whatever, and it would apply that revised generation source to the existing demand profile, and it would throw out some further decarbonisation for changing the technology. We don't ask for very much information other than what the fuel type might be and what the volume of that fuel is that's going to be used for that technology. So we're not interested in the cost of implementing it or anything like that. We're just calculating a additional carbon benefit from that future change of technology. So that's the future decarbonisation network tab. And then probably easier to understand is the future decarbonisation demand tab. And this is just a list of additional customers that you haven't included within your scheme, but that you are reasonably certain could connect up if your network went past their door or went near to them. So this might be new developments in a local authority master plan, or it might be large customers that you have maybe had initial talks to but have said they want to wait and see before they decide. But these are customers that you haven't included in your scheme, because if you include customers in your scheme, that the rest of the application asks for evidence in support of those customers being in the scheme, like what stage of discussions are you at, do you have heads of terms with them, etc., etc. So these are more are less certain customers, and we ask what the customer type is, what the building type is, building age, so some kind of basic information about them. And then if you could provide us with a really simple indication of the certainty, your estimate of their certainty, and the demand that they're likely to take, the amount of heat they're likely to take from what year, then we don't need any more information than that. We will generate some future decarbonisation benefits for the scoring. Okay, I think I have taken up well enough time, but happy to still answer questions if there are any more.
Thanks, Simon. Yeah, so we've had one through around RHI for an existing biomass boiler. So the project has installed a biomass boiler 5 or so years ago, and they're looking to access HNIP funding to extend the district heating system. In terms of completing the application form, is there anything specific that they need to be aware of?
I think Andrew will have a comment on this, but I think there's a more fundamental question underlying that, which is that the HNIP application is only for costs that haven't yet been incurred. So I would say you're obviously not going to include the cost of the plant that is that has RHI income associated with it, and because of that, I don't think we're interested in the RHI income either in relation to this application. So I wouldn't expect to see the cost or the income in relation to that.
So as you're quite right, Simon, I would be interested in it. This is probably a situation we should have a more detailed conversation about, because the really intriguing thing about HNIP is every project seems to be different and peculiar in its own individual way. We would need to unpick that. That there's if the situation is that there's a boiler which is receiving a biomass system that's receiving RHI money, and the intention is to connect a heat network to it, as Simon says, we definitely wouldn't be including the costs of installing the biomass boiler because it's already there, but the costs of the heat network might be applicable. And then the question is what we'd need to be very clear about the boundaries of what was being applied for and the business model around that system, and then that would decide the extent to which the RHI would come in. A key factor would be whether the RHI can possibly change as a result of this. As in, if you're getting more RHI money from providing more heat, then that would definitely need to be in the model. But we need to talk about that in detail. Normally RHI affects eligibility of costs, which is the thing that has been flagged up in the chat. So where RHI is being received, then costs will be, some costs may be ineligible. But of course, with RHI being essentially closed, all but, this is going to be quite rare for this to matter. James has understood anyway. There was a question too, Sam, about state aid.
Yeah, so I've sent a message through to our colleagues at LuxNova just to provide a bit more clarification on that. Andrew, if you got any more that you can provide.
Yes, so I think the first point is that the state aid assessment is another indicator. If a project fails the state aid test, it's another indicator that it's probably not a very strong project, because projects fail the state aid test when they need a lot of support, a lot of grant in order to make them viable. Otherwise, they wouldn't be rubbing up against the limits. So we don't use it as a hard rule at all, because it's no longer, the current test is no longer valid. However, the parallel thing is we're still committed on world trade terms to avoiding unfair state subsidies, and we're in the rather tricky position whereby we've all got to obey rules that we don't quite know what they are yet. And so we're for the time being, the state passing the current state aid test is an indicator it's probably okay, and we can worry about it. We probably don't need to worry about it too much. but I'm not a state aid expert by any stretch of the imagination.
Thanks, Andrew. And James, if I receive a response from LuxNova over the next sort of half an hour or so, I'll post that into the chat. Otherwise, we can follow up separately.
But I think fundamentally, the requirement to satisfy us, the authority that will be on the hook for state aid is the authority that receives it. So the purpose of us inserting ourselves in that assessment is just that it would be embarrassing if government was to knowingly make an award that it kind of knew was breaking state aid rules. But ultimately, we're very clear that it is for individual projects to satisfy themselves that they're not breaking state aid rules, which is which is quite convenient considering how difficult it is to understand exactly what the rules are at the moment, if indeed there are any.
Thank you. I think that those were all the questions so far. If there aren't any others, then we'll hand over to Andrew.
Have you stopped my sharing,
Yes.
Sam, or should I do that? Okay.
Oh no, Andrew, is that your
It's mine now. Yeah, you should be seeing mine.
Great.
So, good afternoon, everybody. It's Andrew Cripps here. I work for ACOM, and I lead the team doing the technical assessments. I'm going to run through a little bit about the way we ask you to present the cost information and why it's like that, and also talk very briefly about deliverability, just again to get the principles of this over to you all. We're not going through every question in detail. Cost assessment. The costs are obviously really important in any heat network application. We have a slightly schizophrenic need to look at costs because we're worried that you're asking your costs are over high and we might give you too much money, and we're also worried that your costs are too low. The reality will be the scheme costs more money, and then you'll have the problem of a non-viable scheme. So we're looking at these with a view to both whether your costs are too high or whether they're too low. You know, we'd like it to be right, clearly. The approach we're taking to the cost modelling is shown on the screen. There's quite a lot to it, but of course, cost is very important. So we're interested in whole life costs, and we're interested in all aspects of this, but the focus primarily here is in the life cycle costing. And in this discussion, this is made up with this chrome representing construction, renewal, operation, maintenance, and end of life. In practice, it's the construction costs that really matter the most. Having said that, both of renewal and operation and maintenance all matter significantly. The challenge we have with all of this is people represent these in slightly different ways. So we're hoping through this process to encourage people to present the costs in a similar way to make our comparison easier, which I'm going to take you through. So I'm going to focus first on construction costs. Essentially, construction costs are going to be represented under these top headings. And obviously, not every scheme has all of these. In fact, very relatively few have electrical distribution and coolth, but obviously some do. So if those are present, we want to see them. Every project has heat distribution. Most projects have an energy center, not necessarily all. Occasionally they already exist, but usually there's an energy center where the main plant is, and there can be costs at the customer end, and they're good to understand properly. Obviously, almost every connection will have a heat exchanger. So those could are best represented there, but they can also sometimes be in here. And then project costs. These are on costs which are associated with all projects. And it's cleaner for us if they're presented separately to all the others, but we're well aware that people will have the cost representation they've been given by their project teams, and this may not be as easy, but this is the way we like to see them, and I'll show you a bit more about this in a moment. We also then have levels of cost information, cost tiers. And this again is about layers of detail. So under Energy Centre, there's a physical building. There are the things that supply that do the work of the heat network, and there are also going to be utility costs. So and then below that, there's tier 3. So there's the physical building of the Energy Centre and any utilities and external works around the building. And then we'll have low and zero carbon heating and other perhaps gas peaking boilers. Gas, electric, and other utilities. And this again is to indicate we want to see the right sort of level of breakdown, because tier 4 would then break down and have the different, for example, you might have 2 or 3 or 4 heat pumps that might be represented in there and other equipment. So when we look at the cost assessment, as I mentioned, is important in the scheme, and we do two. It comes through in 2 key areas. One is it is one of the scored elements in deliverability. I'm going to talk about more later. So there is a scoring basically on how well we think you have represented the cost. But much more, although that matters, much more important is us getting comfortable that your costs are reasonable, so that the grant or loan that you might end up with is appropriate to the scheme, and also that you haven't been too optimistic about the scheme in a way that might mean that it is unable to proceed, which is not good for anybody. So in scoring your application in the cost section, we're interested in the level of detail that's been provided, so the quality, the accuracy of it, which is assessed on whether, once we've taken everything into account, we think that you're in line with where we'd expect costs to be, or if there are differences that we understand why they are different. And finally, what is the basis of your the evidence for your cost plan? Was it generated by somebody plucking numbers from the air, or the best case of all in general is a committed tender return, a tender return that's been committed to, at which point there are that's a very solid position to be in, not one that we see all that often, unfortunately, but a possibility. This may be stating the obvious, but if you're presenting evidence to back up your costs, which we'd like you to do, it's obviously very helpful if the values are the same. If they're not the same, then if you can explain why that would be, because we know that can happen. You might have a consultant report that's 4 months old, and you know that one specific cost has changed. So if you can explain why that's happened, that again will give us confidence in what you're doing. We're extremely aware of how dynamic these things are and how difficult it can be. But at the same time, as you'll have understood from what I'm saying, this is an important feature of it. And the last point is where you're presenting evidence is coming from a reliable source, then we'd expect that to be matched with with the logo on that source, whether it's from a tenderer or a cost consultant. So that's the principle of this. Moving on, just to give you an example, this is one we think is pretty good. Elements here of costs under the Energy Centre, a series of different components down the list here for the building, for the sorry, I've got a call I need to reject, so it's gone. The physical building, energy supply, supporting mechanical services to make it all work, supporting electrical services, and then elements of on cost here. And this one hasn't presented it the way we'd like, but at least it's very clear what these elements are, prelims and overhead and other costs associated with the building, and which essentially you see in every project, but they don't belong specifically assigned to any of these costs, but they need to be present. So as I said, the capex is the major focus. Repex, the replacement cost, is much is necessarily less complex. We'd expect many of the things not to need replacing over the life of the scheme. You'd hope your energy centre would last the whole life of the scheme and your pipework. So we wouldn't expect to see that being replaced wholesale. But clearly, heat generating plant would be being replaced over time. So we'd expect to see those appearing in the Repex model, and that's distinct then from maintenance or OPEX costs. So obviously there'll be costs associated with maintaining the different components of the system, an ongoing cost, for example, for water treatment for your heat network. So these should all appear in the OPEX, and this is obviously you've got all the cost of buying fuel, which is also part of the overall analysis, but that feeds much more strongly into the so that's not part of our cost appraisal, although it's obviously part of the overall appraisal because it feeds into the FEAM, as do all of these. So that should give you a flavour really that it's not hundreds of pages. We don't want to know the cost of every washer and nut and bolt, but we do need to have a sufficient breakdown that we can make sense of what's going on and where and why there might be divergence from what we would see as typical costs. And in particular, going back up, the energy centre costs tend to be relatively standard, but there might well be specific costs to the scheme, which if you can make as clear as possible, for example, moving some item that's in the way, or a river or canal crossing, which we all know can be very expensive, and they're quite hard to benchmark because they vary. They're quite bespoke. So the more you can explain those, the better. I would expect you to need to know that too, because you are no doubt doing the same sort of analysis as we are. To summarize on costs, essentially the more detail the better for a project, notwithstanding my previous point about we're not interested in every washer. There is an other category, because we know categorization can be difficult, but if you can try to avoid using the other category unless it really is difficult to fit into one of the main ones, and please explain it if you are using it to help us to make sense of your numbers. I don't think we've had too much trouble with this actually, but please don't include irrelevant costs. These irrelevant costs are things which simply aren't part of the heat network, or costs, in particular costs which, as the example there, which have already been installed. So, and as was mentioned before, or a biomass boiler. If it's already there, the cost of that doesn't matter. We're only interested in the forward costs that go into the calculation. There's more extreme examples of irrelevant costs, which would essentially be fraudulent, holidays in the Caribbean, whatever. Clearly, but we're not expecting to see that. But this is more the one there. The example is a helpful one in terms of things that are already gone. We get another interesting example is other efficiency measures or generation measures. So PV panels are occasionally have occasionally been included, and in general they shouldn't be. But if you've got a scheme with integrated renewables or integrated efficiency measures, then talk to us about it before you apply, because those things are obviously part of an energy system and may make sense to include under some circumstances. So don't put them in without talking to us first. Costs should be all encompassing. So that's why we mentioned the on costs. They do include the fees and risks and various other on costs. Right at the start, Amy mentioned contingency, and this is always a tricky issue for everybody. Do we include how much contingency should you include? Because if your scheme's got no contingency, it's quite vulnerable. to changes in cost. It's not at all unusual for costs to change, and unfortunately often upwards. So we do expect to see some contingency. The public sector has this term they use called optimism bias, which is essentially another form of contingency. It's an expectation that projects will turn out worse than people hope they will. People tend to be optimistic, and people can and should also cost risk. But what we ask you to be wary about, as was said at the beginning, is don't put in 20% for risk and 20% for optimism bias and a 20% contingency, because your scheme probably won't be very attractive at the end of that. So it's a question of being realistic around those to balance a competitive application with a realistic one that can be delivered. And I'm sure people would like detailed guidance on that, but it isn't really a thing. You know, it's the same that you're grappling with anybody else you're interacting with on the project. You've got to come to a sensible compromise. I've mentioned a couple of times about understanding the source of data. So we'd expect to see the evidence for that. And if any of this isn't clear, then talk to the BDM who's been assigned to you, or you'll often have been talking with one of my ACOM colleagues as well, who can go on helping with that. Now, as has been said, because I'm in screen slideshow mode, I can't see any questions.
Sorry, Andrew. Yeah, so we've had one through for project originators, for example, local authorities and other public entities, prior to submission, putting together the basis of the project around energy mapping, network, civils to commercial and techno-economic feasibility to piping hardware, it can be difficult to know where to go. A good port of call to get support is from Stoke Depot, where certified. It's less of a comment and more of a helping hand to other people. So just pointing people towards Stoke Depot, where certified public procurement frameworks are available. Then there's a bit of information there for other people. Were there any specific questions for Andrew on the cost side of things?
If anybody does, we can come back. I'll do the deliverability piece, and then we will. If anybody's thought of any other questions, that's fine.
Great.
Okay. So deliverability. So as we heard before, the four scored elements have been talked about before: heat and carbon and future decarbonisation, and the fourth scored element is deliverability. And the remaining parts of the application form are all where we are gathering information to help test the extent to which your scheme is deliverable. This isn't a yes/no question. It's multifaceted, but the whole thing obviously matters a great deal. There's no point in us committing taxpayers' money to your scheme if in reality it's got limited chance of going ahead. In the process, we do assess a lot of different things, and the impact of each of them on the scoring is quite small. So each one doesn't matter all that much. Having said that, if there's an obvious major problem in some of these categories, that can result in the collective view that the scheme is too risky to take forward. And so it is an important section. Certainly if people haven't completed it, then that would be a fail. You know, we need to know where people are, and it essentially, as well, we need to know that where they are and that their plans look like they're going to get them to where they need to be, which I'll touch on a little bit more. I've listed on the screen the 7 component areas of deliverability that we score. I will touch on them all briefly as we go through. But the first thing is to recognise that some projects apply seeking just construction money, and other projects are applying first for commercialization and then for construction. We welcome projects coming forward in either category. Given that we're approaching the end of the scheme, there is a case for it being much more attractive where people are ready to construct. In any case, they'll need a pretty compact commercialization stage. A project which is going into commercialization will obviously be less, we'd expect it to be less developed than one applying straight for construction. And inevitably that will mean the score will be a bit lower. But that's unavoidable, but we can't, that's the reality of this. We want schemes which are more deliverable, which they're likely to be if they're ready for construction. Many of our projects have received commercialization funding. It's not a barrier to success. And in fact, the deliverability assessment, applying for it, going through the process should be helpful for you to understand where you're at. So it'd be a good idea to look at this now, because the work you plan to do in commercialization should be addressing the weaknesses in your deliverability position, which we can talk about a little bit as we go through the next slides. If a project is ready to construct, you ought to have nearly everything in place. So when you look at these questions, if you're ready to construct, you should have you should know the status of relationship with your customers. Ideally, they're signed up or close to signing. You should know who's going to build your scheme and who's going to operate it. And if they're not signed up, they should be nearly signed up. We realize they may not be signed up because you haven't got your sufficient funding, and that's why you're applying. But it would be, we're not expecting people applying for construction to have a great deal of work to be done. And in this context, none of the things we're asking for in this section should be difficult for you to do. If they are difficult, it suggests you're perhaps not quite as ready as you think you are. So on terms of the issues, stakeholders, we have revenue-related stakeholders and all the other stakeholders. I think everybody will agree that your paying customers are probably the single most important stakeholders you have to worry about. If you haven't got the customers signed up, then we do need to know where you are in that process. Evidence for that is important. If you're having negotiations with them, then there should be some evidence that that's going on. We recognise fully, as I've already hinted at, that without a scheme coming together, you are unlikely to have customers signed in blood on the dotted line. But equally, if there's no indication that they're engaging with the process, then that's a significant concern for us about whether the scheme will really happen. We know there's a big chicken and egg thing here going on about which comes first, but we need this to be progressed enough. And then all the other stakeholders, again, we need to know where you are, and this will vary significantly depending on the project. There are ones which apply to nearly everybody around planning and permissions. But an interesting example is if you're looking to take heat from an EFW plant or from a body of water, we'd expect you to have agreement with where that heat's coming from, because it's obviously super critical. An EFW scheme without agreement from the EFW plant is really not deliverable. Again, it may not be signed, but it should be well on the way, or at least at an appropriate stage, particularly in commercial, construction. Okay, so in the another area here is around the technical deliverability. This is appraising a number of issues around both the extent to which your design is developed, and I've used the phrase, rather vague phrase, enough. Essentially, for the point in the application, is the design in a shape we'd expect it to be? If the design's not developed enough, we worry that the costs will be very shaky, and also the carbon savings. So we'd expect to see sufficient design to be in a position to have some reasonable confidence in the costs, and that it's all possible. as an example, is if you haven't got an energy centre layout such that we can have confidence that it's actually going to fit in the site you've got planned, that would not be a good thing. So we'd expect at least an element of energy centre design, not just a box, even at commercialisation stage, which most people would have. Program is really important to us. And this applies just as much to commercialisation. If people don't have a detailed plan for how their scheme's going to be worked up to the point of signing the contracts and then built over a realistic time that makes sense in the context of their business plan, then that's a significant concern. And we've had quite a lot of problems with underdeveloped programs. People should be thinking about this. We don't quite get why people would come forward without this, because surely all of their sponsors want the same information. So basically, if you haven't got a design and you haven't got a program, then why are you? In what sense are you ready? We've covered cost previously, so the final two areas are finance and governance. This isn't my field. I'm very much from an engineering perspective, but there are some pretty obvious things we'd expect you to know. Who's applying, who will receive the money, where does all the other money come from that's going to add up to the total CapEx? How do the different organisations that are mentioned in the application fit together? Who's going to do what time frame, who's responsible for which pieces? And in the unhoped for but possible event that the people delivering the scheme hit the rocks financially, what will happen then? Now, if you're a public sector applicant, probably the local authority will be the supplier of last resort. But if you're a private sector applicant, we expect you to have thought about this, because what we absolutely can't do is have customers, particularly vulnerable, more vulnerable customers, domestic customers, left without heat. So we have to know that there is a solution in that situation. Now, I hope you'd agree that if you don't know the answers to these pretty basic questions, then it doesn't look like you're ready to proceed. So these features are quite important, and we look closely at the financial model that you're working with, as well as what comes from the FEAM, and we look to understand the way that the different organisations are intended to function. This shouldn't be complicated for you, because you must have worked this out if you're planning to do a scheme. So that was quite rapid, conscious of the we could talk at great length about each of the questions, but I think I hope that's helpful just in kind of setting the scene. We're at the last piece, just to touch on guidance. If there aren't any specific questions, I can't see that there are any.
No, Andrew, I haven't seen any others come through. Just because there's only a couple more slides left, would you mind putting your slides into sharing mode, and I'll just talk through the last few. So thank you all for sitting through the presentations. Just a couple slides from me, just to highlight that we have a range of online support and guidance documents available to help you, as well as support from our business development managers. So you heard from Amy earlier. Lauren also works really closely with Amy and supports a number of our projects. We have some support videos which run through some of the key areas of the application process. And Andrew, if you move on to the next slide, just to highlight the different publications that we have available as well. So the application guidance, as Amy said, is a bit like the Bible. We refer to it all the time. We've produced a number of clarification documents which have now all been incorporated into the application guidance. So there's no need for you to flick between different documents, although it may be useful if you have a specific question about the counterfactual technologies or a special purpose vehicle, for example. You might find it easier to go to the separate documents. The application form is also available on our website on the resources page as well, or the apply page. You can access it in both places. And the next slide, please, Andrew. Perfect. And just a reminder, we publish information about our funded projects and regularly share updates from them. So please do check that out. If you're not already on our mailing list and would like to be, just drop us an email at comms.acuity@tpheatnetworks.org. And we also have social media channels as well where we share this information. Next slide, please, Andrew. And just a reminder to everyone, I shared a survey link in the chat. It'd be really great if you could complete it. Only takes 2 or 3 minutes to complete. Just a few multiple choice questions. Thank you so much. If there are any further questions, we're happy to take those. And if there aren't any, please enjoy the 15 minutes that you've gained back of your morning. Thank you all so much for joining.